So 2.6 is the dynamic interactive turn. This monolingual paradigm, another consequence of the structuralist view of languages, is formally autonomous. Like we already debunked this theory, right? That languages are not by themselves inherently better or worse than others, or they cannot develop by their own, and their structure isn't the most important part of them, but rather it should be their functions, right? This structuralist view of languages as formally autonomous, bounded systems, like bound by grammar, led to a conception of the result of second language acquisition as essentially double monolingualism or parallel monolingualism. So this is important. Let's read the end first. Two language silos existing side by side without any interaction. Alright, so this means that before, when people used to believe in the monolingual paradigm, in the monolingual bias, they used to think that languages, their grammar, they are the most important part of languages. So when people learn two languages, it's like they have two brain systems, like they have two separate areas in their brain where they keep their two languages, or if it's three languages, then 3, 4, 4. So those things they used to consider were static, right? So without any interaction, as if there were language silos, language missiles existing side by side. The connotation here being that it's dangerous if they mix. So when they mix, there can be interference, like pronunciation interference, but at least they will be different, like 1, 2, 3, 4. They will be side by side and not interacting with each other. So that is the static view, and that was the former view before World English has changed that perspective. So the World English has brought in the dynamic and the interactive turner, right? So I think you understand what I'm trying to say here, is that before it was a static and not interactive turn, but now it has become the dynamic and interactive turn. The learner's first language, when it was acknowledged at all, means the say it's Bangla or Hindi, okay, or Chinese. So the first language had only a nuisance value, so it was considered as a nuisance. So it was only responsible for interference errors and other errors. As a source of transfer, like L1 transfer or interference errors, which were to be eliminated. So people used to think about the first language to be like a barrier to the learning of the second language. Yes, second language acquisition was possible, they thought, but the first language, it interfered with the second language acquisition. So that's what they thought. Transfer, the most obvious effect of multilingualism, which means that when we're trying to speak in one language, then elements of the first language come in. For example, I sometimes did say out of mistake, I did mistakenly say mane, like instead of I wanted to say that means that, and this is an example of transfer, and it can be even more, just not one word, but it happens. It's a natural occurrence of people who are learning a second language. Transfer, the most obvious effect of multilingualism, was discounted as a behaviorist explanation, and apparent transfer effects were sought to be explained away in terms of general cognitive strategies. Alright, so behaviorism, it's a very important, but it's an outdated theory that said that according to behaviorism, people learn things by doing things out of repetition, doing things in repetition, by doing things, and by having encouragement, positive encouragement, negative encouragement, reinforcement. Because of that, by a force of habit, people learn doing what they do. So people used to think that babies, children, small children, they learned language by imitation, by imitating other people. And according to this view, behaviorist view, so the first language, because of the practice, it was entrenched into the mind, and that's why it sometimes transferred over to the second language, and it sometimes interfered with the development of the second language. So that was the behaviorist view explanation, and apparent transfer effects were sought to be explained away in terms of general cognitive strategies. So they wanted to explain any errors, quote unquote errors, by saying that these have to be something related to the brain, and strategies can be used. However, as we and others have pointed out, for example, Sridhar, another article, two articles given here, 1980 1975, transfer is perfectly compatible with a cognitive theory of language acquisition. So cognitive theory of language acquisition and transfer, these two terms, these two theories can actually coexist together, both can be right. The first language is an obvious hypothesis that the learner tries out in constructing the second language rule system. So obviously, since we already knew our first language, Bangla, before we got to know English, before we got to learn English, we already knew that in Bangla there are such things as nouns, right, prepositions, adjectives, the same as in English. So we knew that there had to be a subject and an object, like ami bhat khai, like I, and bhat is this object, and khai, the action, the agent, right? The agent is ami. So here, since we already knew a language, that's why we can transfer that rule knowledge to English. However, if you can notice this, that English, the rule of English, subject verb object, is not the same as Bangla subject object verb. Ami is the subject, and bhat is the object, then khai, subject object verb comes last. But in English, I eat rice, right? It's not I rice eat, but I eat rice. So it's not the same, but there are also similarities, right? Like for example, there are nouns in both languages, there are adjectives. So yes, transfer does happen, and people, when learning a second language, they think of the first language as their base. They think about that what are the rules of that, and they try to match the rules with the second language. That's why many people try to translate in their heads, like this is the Bangla word, I know the Bangla word and I know the Bangla sentence of how I want to say this, but how do I translate this into English? So beginning Bangladeshi people who are learning English, they will tend to translate, and even adult Bangladeshi people also tend to translate if their language proficiency is not that high. So it can be resolved with practice, but anyway, the point is that the language transfer happens and it's natural, right? Okay, so where was I? It's an obvious hypothesis that the learner tries out in constructing the second language rule system. Alright, the pedagogic, which means the teaching related pathologizing of language transfer, is based on both an ideological and functional consideration. So both things are there, ideology and functional. So these are the reasons. Ideologically, because there has always been a preference for linguistic purity and resistance to mixing of systems, right? As we already talked about this, that people used to think that monolingual language users are the best because they only know one language, there is no transfer, there is no scope of interference. So they thought that monolingual English speakers were the best English speakers. But we don't think about it like that anymore. We think that people, if they can communicate with many people, then they are better. Intercultural and interlinguistic competence is better than monolingual competence, right? Functionally, so that was the ideologically part. People thought that people had this ideology that any kind of mixing of two languages is a negative thing. So that was the reason. That was one reason. Second reason was functionally, the claim is that transfer impedes means stops or acts as a barrier to intelligibility. So as we already discussed, intelligibility means the ability to be comprehended, to be understood. But these arguments do not apply in multilingual communities. Again, the argument is that more than twice the number of people are actually non-native speakers, and they speak to non-native speakers. So there is no actually reason why to think of the native speaker as the model. So in multilingual communities,
people don't actually have this problem of intelligibility. They actually are very much intelligible, even more. For a Bangladeshi speaker of English who is speaking to another Bangladeshi speaker in English, then those two people will be even more intelligible than the another scenario where a foreigner, an American, is speaking with a Bangladeshi person who is speaking in English, right? Because the Bangladeshi people, they're of the same country, they have similar accents, they have similar other things, so they can be more intelligible. So intelligibility is the main thing rather than the quote-unquote standard English, right? It's not that the American and British people should be the standard, but that the more people can understand each other, the more intelligible people are to each other, the better language users they are. But these arguments do not apply in multilingual communities, which are more typical of the contexts where most second language acquisition and use take place, where difference is not automatically equated with deficit. Deficit means decrease, and accents, borrowings, convergence, and code mixing are expected and accepted. So these things are both natural, and these things are actually, I'd say that these are identity markers, right? Like different people will speak differently, like Chinua Achebe said, like Raja Rao said. So these are sprinklings of our own identity when we use the English. In such contexts of shared verbal repertoires, transfer and mixing are natural outcrops of the ecology of multilingualism, and no more of an impediment to communication than style or register switching among monolinguals. Alright, so style is the way we speak or the way we write. There are lots of writing styles, there are lots of speaking styles, and register is when specialized vocabulary, specialized ways of speaking. For example, if two literature majors are speaking, they may naturally talk about specific terms that they all both know. If two rocket scientists are speaking, then they will speak about terms. If two doctors are speaking, they will speak in terms which other people who have not studied there or have not experienced or have not come across such terms, they will not understand or they will have difficulty to understand. So such verbal repertoires like Bangladeshi English, these should not be considered as bad, or this should not be considered as a lesser than variety than the British and American English, but rather this is just a different style or register, right? This is so this should be considered as a different variation, but not an inferior one. Instead, they are value-added features, right? So these are considered to be valuable, but not. While traditional models of SLA view the learner's second language in isolation from their other languages, so these were the traditional models of SLA, bracketing out all but one language, World Englishes, so SLA used to think of this, but World Englishes was more accepting, recognizes that the language of a multilingual not only complement one another in discrete domains, discrete means separate, but also overlap one another within many domains, and in fact within sentences. So multilinguals actually are more communicable, and they have more communication skills. They can communicate with other people, and also there are many other things, there are many other domains where their languages overlap and actually help them. Having access to more than one language help them. This overlap has been studied extensively in the World Englishes paradigm with reference to many processes including borrowing, transfer, convergence, code switching, code mixing, stylistic stratification, and bilingual creativity. So all these are specific fields of research. You can search them up. I conducted a research on code switching on Facebook, where people switch codes or switch from English to Bangla, or sometimes even maybe Hindi. So why do they do that? Is that just because their English is not good? No, that's not the main reason at all. The main reason is that having such a hybrid style, it's actually richer than a monolingual style. These phenomena have been studied with reference to psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, literary stylistics, to name a few disciplinary rubrics. Almost contemporaneous. So remember I said that contemporary means the time at which we are talking about, right? Normally contemporary means modern, but here with the pioneering studies of code switching by Gumpers and his associates. So Gumpers and his associates means he wrote a paper with Blom in 1972. So contemporaneous doesn't mean 2021 here or 2018, because this paper was written in 2018. But here almost contemporaneous means at the time of when Gumpers was studying code switching, which is 1972. World Englishes was one of the earliest paradigms to address hybridization of language systems in multilingual context situations. So as I said, that code switching, it reveals that people don't only switch to another language just because they have a deficiency in one language or the other. Rather, they switch languages because it is more convenient, it is more even richer, you can say. It makes the communication even more fluid. So there are a lot of advantages, not just disadvantages, and maybe there are even no disadvantages at all. The porosity of language systems. So the porosity, it comes from the word porous, which means that it has space in between it, like the space bubble, so it can absorb things. So the main thing here in this word, it means that it can absorb. The porosity of language systems, it means that it can absorb things from other languages to become more convergent, to bridge the gap and become even more enriched. The porosity of language systems and the challenges this poses both to monolingual grammars and to a psycholinguistic account of bilingual language processing. Now cutting edge topics in psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic research, these are the scholars, was highlighted from the 1970s onwards. So this hybridity that I was talking about, and Sridhar was were talking about, these things were highlighted from the 1970s, and these are World Englishes scholars. Consider this observation. So here we have a long quote from Sridhar, 1992. So he says, the permeability of syntax. So permeable means permeable membrane, right? So which allows water or other minerals to flow through it, to pass through it. So here the permeability means that syntax or the sentence structure, it allows other linguistic features of other languages to blend in together, and it isn't that these differences, when it becomes blended, it's not that they are errors, but rather they are hybrids. The permeability of syntax makes both psycholinguistic and sociolinguistic sense. By extending the rules of the mother tongue to the other tongue, the speaker minimizes cognitive dissonance and maximizes cognitive economy. So I really like this phrase. So cognitive dissonance is when we cannot actually think of something, or we are thinking of something but we cannot say it, or there's a dissonance, there's a conflict there. So for example, we are thinking of something but we remember a word from another language but not word from our other language. It can even be that we are not remembering the word of our mother tongue, but we do remember the word in the English language, so we can use it, right? So mixing languages together, it's not a subtractive effect that it takes away from perfection, as if monolingualism is the ideal, but rather maximizes cognitive economy. So if you are racking your brains to think of a single word, for example, I talked about it in language related hesitancy, right? Language related hesitation. So yes, sometimes you do have to stick to one language. For example, if it's an academic presentation or a speech it's an important speech, you have to stick to one language. But normally what happens is that you're just talking to someone because of communicative reasons, right? Not because of other formal reasons. So in those situations, if you can use two languages, then it increases your time, it lessens hesitancy. If you can remember one word from one language, you can borrow from the other. So this borrowing, this mixing of languages, it's very economical. It saves you time, it saves you it saves your hesitation, it makes you feel more confident, it makes you feel more natural. For example, I speak and type in Bangladesh, right? Bangla and English mixed together normally, not in this channel. And because the interlocutors are also bilingual and share the same rule systems, such transfer does not interfere with intelligibility. So it's when the interlocutors are also bilingual. Like if you're talking to someone who only understands English, then your use of Bangla will not help him or her, or it will rather hurt it, right? This is obvious. But for example, if you are speaking to a fellow Bangladeshi and you are speaking in English, but you sprinkle in some Bangla words, sometimes you just do it for comic value or for quotation. For example, I sometimes do it. Just for example, I used Ami Bhat Khai. If I didn't know Bangla, or if you didn't know Bangla, then me using it would have made no sense, right? But since we do know these two languages, sometimes using one, sometimes mixing them together is very good, and it does not interfere with intelligibility. It does not hamper comprehension. We all understand each other. As I have stated elsewhere, transfer is the grease or the oil that makes the wheels of bilingual communication run smoothly. It's a beautiful sentence, right? One might go further and even suggest that such transfer, by polishing off the rough edges of the foreign language rule system and reducing the differences, makes the use of the other tongue more acceptable in a bilingual situation. So here it's a stronger argument. It's a bit controversial, but Sridhar is saying that if you know two languages, and if you're speaking with someone who also knows these two same languages, then if you only use one language, for example, I'm talking to you, if I only use one language, English, or even if I use Bangla, then there will be some words or some situations where there will be some hesitation, or there will be some time in order to think of what was the target thing that I was going to talk about, or there could be any type of difficulty. But the ideal situation is to mix and match, right? Even if it's your mother tongue, if you are we are all pretty much we've all mastered our mother tongue still. Sometimes English, because of the globalization, we sometimes only speak about some English words, right? For example, who says kedara instead of chair? So these words, mixing and matching is the best. So that's what Sridhar says. The monolingual blinder of the dominant SLA paradigms makes them assume a dichotomy, like either one or the other, right? We discussed this. A compartmentalization between the L2 and the other languages in the learner or user's repertoire, and ignore, discourage, and devalue the latter. Latter means the other languages in the learner's or user's repertoire. So it was the monolingual blindness or the monolingual hegemony. The traditional SLA ideology was this, like it ignored the other languages of one person, and it made them think about black and white, like either this or that. Everything monolingual, either English or Bangla or Hindi. So nothing in between, not a mixing, not a hybrid. These languages are not viewed as resources. They are at best shadowy presences which have only a nuisance value as sources of interference, and as the incompetent learner's last resort for performing without competence. So it was other languages were considered totally as disadvantageous. The learner is urged to think in the L2 and avoid code switching or mixing, and teachers are asked to use the direct method untainted by the mother tongue. This dichotomy is both functional and formal. The domains of the use of the L2 and other languages are not expected to overlap, nor are the grammars supposed to interact, transfer, mixed systems, convergence, interpenetration of systems, are all stigmatized. Means there was no scope for hybridity, and any type of mixing of languages was discouraged. The dichotomy model in current SLA theories denies the constructive contributions of transfer, its effective role in taming the Firangi foreign tongue into a less alien system, its cognitive or psycholinguistic role in bridging the structural distance between disparate means separate or distant systems, reducing cognitive dissonance, its referential role in enriching the expressive resources of the L2 in the lexicon, syntax, discourse, and pragmatics. Its acculturating role in transforming the L2 into a vehicle for the expression of a non-native sociocultural ideational content, and its historical role in contact-induced language change. So these are the advantages of a bilingual or a multilingual multilingual ideology. Like these are the advantages. So but before SLA theorists, they used to actually ignore these advantages. In short, the dichotomy model is out of touch with studies of language contact and historical linguistics. As our 2007 has argued, bi or multilingual talk, including code switching, challenges directly the autonomous homogeneous view of language underpinning structural linguistics and, by extension, cognitive SLA and related TESOL theory and practice. So multilingualism, this idea, that has been put forward by World Englishes. So this is a challenge, and this is in conflict with the traditional SLA and TESOL monolingual bias. It blurs the line between language A and language B, but also between langue and parole. So langue and parole are I think French terms. So these means language, one is language and another is specific language. This is language in general and this is language in particular. Between linguistic systems and there are uses, between knowledge and practice. It questions the starting point of linguistics as a whole. So World Englishes, their view of the multilingualism, it is very it embraces difference, it's unity in diversity. He concludes, the assumption of bound linguistic systems as the object of linguistic research is fundamentally questioned by bilingual or multilingual practices. Lee, this issue, also argues that persisting means staying with, maintaining autonomous linguistic systems. So autonomous it's a negative word here. Autonomous here, it refers to linguistic systems being sentient beings almost, and prioritizing its structure rather than its functional value. So that's why it's autonomous. On the other hand, if we prioritize its language's functional value, then it is not autonomous, because it does not have power on its own. Its structure does not give it power, but we, the users of language, give the language its power. So it is not autonomous, but it is dependent on us. It is not independent. Autonomous is related to independence. Autonomous linguistic systems is problematic and calls for abandoning the notion of separate linguistic systems and adopting the linguistic repertoire model, something World Englishes has been doing from its inception. Alright, so what can we take notes here? So it was more like a summary, right? I think these are the specific advantages of a multilingual model, and we can rewrite this as a note in easier words. Say that multilinguals are Yeah, done.